Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Media Research Group today. Very excited to hear from our music researchers in the school. So we have two presentations today. Dennis Collopy, who's a senior research fellow in music. Dennis, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your research area?
Yeah, my research tends to work on the interface between intellectual property and economics as it applies to media in general, but more specifically in terms of music. And that relates to everything from music piracy to copyright enforcement and how people get paid basically for their work.
Thank you very much. And we also have Rob Godman with us, who's a reader in music. Rob, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hello, everybody. Yep, I'm fundamentally a composer, but in the 1990s, I got most of my funding from being a digital artist, whatever that means. I've done a lot more collaborative, interactive work over the last, particularly the last 15 years, largely to do with collaborations that I've made at the university.
Including one with me playing the water bottles very, very badly.
I forgot all about that. Absolutely.
It was a very entertaining way to occupy myself during the first few sad months of lockdown. I did enjoy it. Okay, great. So looking forward to both of these very much. Dennis is going to start us off. So I'm going to mute myself and disappear and hand over to you, Dennis. And then we'll hear from Rob afterwards, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. We'll keep it till the end, and we'll have discussion with everybody at the end. All right. So whenever you're ready, Dennis, go for it.
All right, I'll just click share screen and go into that. And hopefully this will come up.
Yeah, we've got that. That's perfect.
And let's just go to the actual slides. There you go.
Great stuff.
Oh, gone to the wrong one. Let's go back to the beginning. Oh, you're seeing all my slides now. This is not the intention. Right, okay. So what's that doing there? Okay, so well, I should preface this by saying this is something I've been working on for quite some time, and Stephen will be pleased to hear that this is perhaps going to be the basis of what will be a PhD thesis. But I've been exploring this for over 10 years because, you know, my own professional background is as a music publisher, but as an academic, I'm always interested in the things that actually have changed, particularly in the last 20 years. And my thesis essentially is that actually things have changed, or a lot of things have changed, but the fundamentals of music publishing have not changed anywhere near as much as we assume that they have in terms of the recorded music market. So the title is Reinventing the Model. It's a period of disruption, disintermediation, disaffection, dismay, and disposals. And it pretty is what I'm going to try and do is navigate the period essentially since the year 2000 and bring it up to date. There's a hell of a lot that's actually happened that's very pertinent to that. And they are a reflection of the broader concerns of what's happening to music creators in the digital age, particularly composers. So this is not just about record labels and featured artists, and perhaps even performers. It's actually the people who actually create the music in the first place, what I would describe as the DNA of music. So it highlights the challenges to existing norms and liminal processes of adjusting to the demands of the emerging and not yet dominant digital market. So in music publishing, digital is still not even close to what it is in records. It accounts for about 50% of total revenues or total uses, whereas in recorded music, we talk about it essentially as 80 to almost 90% of our revenues come from digital. So what music publishing has been very successful in doing is preserving analog markets. That is live concert performances, that is radio, that's television broadcasts. So it's not the same as the recorded music market. And I've said 80%, well, the figures released in the last few days actually suggest that that market is almost 90% now digital. And this liminal dilemma has been described by a wonderful friend of mine called Jim Griffin in 2010 as Tarzan Economics. We referenced that in our Music 2025 report. It's also the title of a new book by a very well-known economist called Will Page, who similarly cites Griffin as the source of the term. And essentially, Tarzan Economics is where incumbent rights owners, sorry, I can't actually read the screen now. Let me go. Or incumbent rights owning businesses exist. They can't move because of the uncertainty swinging over to another business model. In other words, a lot of the fabric of the music publishing business is still largely based on what it used to be in the 20th century. And the reason we can't change entirely to new digital norms is because we're still making an increasingly profitable and still relevant sum of money. So the term was devised by Jim, who characterized the conundrum as Tarzan Economics. What's going on now? So this is his quote: "We cling to this vine that keeps us off the jungle floor, yet at the same time we swing for the next vine because we want to be propelled forward. The trick is figuring out when to let go of that old vine and when to embrace that new vine." It's particularly pronounced for those for whom the old vine is still profitable. And that is very much the story of music publishing. So the way Will Page, for example, has used this term is very much to describe the dilemmas facing the record labels. So my thesis is very much about concentrating on this one very important sector. So roughly about 40% of the total recorded music sector is music publishing. Record labels account for about 60%. So I'm really talking about that 40% chunk that's perhaps the historical, almost the parent of the modern day music industry. Quick run through this. I won't bore you too much, but we used to have a very cohesive national system, multilateral system of licensing that pretty much worked very well. There were different norms in different countries, but a global system that worked. This, at the turn of the 21st century, was very much disrupted and caused a lot of fragmentation. So, for example, in the European Union, you used to have to get 28 different licenses. Now you have to get 42. So instead of making it simpler, they've actually made it much, much more complex. So the European Union, instead of being resourceful and coming up with a single point across the whole of Europe, has actually gone in the opposite direction. Whereas in America, which is traditionally regarded as probably the most dysfunctional market for licensing, they've gone in the opposite direction. The Americans have created this single national point in America that deals with all the licensing. And it's only really in response to the chaos that's been caused by digital music uses. And we're going to touch on the effects of that shortly. But the Americans uniquely passed this amazing law, ironically signed by the Orange Man, called the 2008 Music Modernization Act. And this is a fundamental signpost to the future of music. We did some work in Music 2025 where we talked about the data that allows musicians and creators to actually get paid, which is deeply, deeply flawed. There was an attempt made to create a single global repertoire database. Here it's referred to as the GRD. And it's crazy. There are 120 different collection societies around the world, each of them maintaining their own database, and it's chaos. The mass duplication of this data means that data in the UK is not always reflected contemporaneously or even punctually in other databases. It really is very, very difficult. Some solutions have been developed, including the use of these so-called music hubs. But we talked in Music 2025 about the management of rights in a fragmented, contested digital music ecosystem involves mass duplication of effort, very poor interoperability between the record label side and the song, and a staggering increase in data volumes. In the UK alone, this rose from 50 million uses in 2012 to 20 trillion. That's an order of magnitude of 40,000 times more data coming through the system. And what this has meant for creators and songwriters is it's been awful. It's been absolutely awful. And there's really seen a witness of the demise of the relative certainties of analog avenues and and the dismay, the very incredibly low levels of payments produced by digital music services. And this led to the DCMS hearings on the economics of streaming that took place between October 2020 and March 2021, that led to a further report published by the DCMS in July last year, and ongoing research, which we're feeding into this research from the UK IPO into the economics of streaming. And I'm being interviewed, I think, later today as part of that. But really great concerns among the creators. They are really, really struggling. And at the same time, we've seen this disaffection has been accompanied by widespread disposals. Essentially, creators, arguably, or many of them are actually giving up. They're just going, this is just not worth it. The stars have been selling out. You might be hearing stories of Neil Diamond yesterday, Bob Dylan, Neil Young. Staggering sums of money being raised. But essentially, it's almost like the creators are checking out the system, going, you know what, this isn't worth my while anymore. But it's also been disrupted by the arrival of private equity, venture capital-backed entities with incredibly deep pockets. And I believe, and this is my central concern, is they are accelerating a disruption process first initiated by the major publishing players in the early part of this century. And it is my belief or fear, in fact, that this disruption may be far more profound as these new venture capital-backed vehicles plan to create added value. That's the essential part of their business model. And I believe they may conflict with what has been, and I rejoice in saying this, an incredibly valuable contribution to the effective payment and collection and licensing of music called collective licensing. And I believe this is really under threat. So the developments beg the question of whether the current multilateral rights system of interrelated national collection societies is sustainable. And this is really going to be my central concern for my thesis. So why does this all matter? Well, power laws. And this has come from both teaching and particularly an increasing interest I've taken in cultural economics. And why does music work the way it does? And it's ironic when you talk about the economics of music, how little we talk about the importance of these power laws, but they govern so much in terms of how music is distributed and compensated. So we basically bring it down to these two things, blockbuster and long tail. So interesting sidebar, since 2000, the number of full-time songwriters in Nashville has fallen by 80%. So ironically, though, this had much more to do with the unbundling of the album, which was what happened when iTunes arrived. So the long tail theory was a very popular theory developed by Chris Anderson, published in 2006. And it brought the kind of great belief that actually the internet was going to allow far more diversity and opportunity for lots of different types of music to come to market and to do quite well. And the subtitle puts the implications in a nutshell. Consumers can find and afford products more closely tailored to their individual tastes. So Anderson believed they will migrate away from homogenized hits. That's a very important part. And yet the reality we've seen since 2006 is quite the opposite. In fact, we've seen the rise and the dominance of blockbusters. And as Franklin Cook said, is that broad, fast communication and replication create dynamics where popular products become disproportionately profitable and consumers and customers even more likely to converge in their taste and buying habits. So the long tail, according to Anita Elvis, was essentially just a diversion. And actually consumers are really driven and motivated by true blockbusters. So, and I thought, well, what economic theory might actually apply to this? And we come back to this very famous theory developed by an Italian 19th century Italian economist called Pareto. And we probably heard this, the 80-20 rule. You see this in supermarkets. We see so much of this in commerce. So 80% of your income comes from just 20% of your goods. Sorry, I'm just lost my flow there. Hang on a minute. So, and yeah, I just want to go back to that particular point, just to give you an illustration of Pareto. So the way Pareto works in music is in the recorded music market, 90% of the revenues in the CD economy were generated by just 10% of releases. And what we're seeing is a dramatic shift of that number from 80-20 to 90-10 to 99% of the income going to 1% of creators. That is our genuine concern. And a great illustration of that in music publishing is that one of the most famous publishing companies called Chappell, one of the first great publishing companies, when it was sold, someone analyzed the income and they realized that actually 99% of the revenue in that company was generated by 0.1% of the songs under their control. So these power laws play a particular part in the way the industry is organized. So what it means in music publishing is that actually you have to come up with different ways of managing your rights. And what we've seen, and this is my central argument, is that collective licensing, this kind of blanket licensing with performing rights societies around the world, all 120 of them, they take care of the long tail. They take care of all those minute micro uses and do so very, very well, leaving the blockbuster uses, which is synchronization, to be handled directly by the publishers. And this has actually attracted the interest of private equity, because suddenly, and this is in the words of Bowie, they become bonds. They become stable, almost utilities. So music has almost been reduced from this wonderful aesthetic and even intellectual property asset to a utility. And this is Bowie's prediction in 1998, essentially that actually music will just become like running water. And it could be, and very defined forms of cash flows, but underpinned by this collective licensing system. But we now have the arrival, and this is perhaps my greatest concern, of some very deep-pocketed entities led by this remarkable man called Curators, who established a company called Hypnosis. And my fear here is that what's happening is, because of the way digital economies work, we now can measure and have the data to support all of the hit income. We can now carefully distinguish between hits and non-hits much more carefully than we ever could. It's almost taking the risk out of this. And what's happening is that companies are bundling the hit songs and removing them from the non-hit songs, so to speak. And my greatest fear is that actually these could end up being taken out of the entire collective licensing system altogether. And these are extraordinary sums of money coming into music publishing currently. In the past 12 months, we've seen some close, I would imagine we're talking somewhere between $5 and $10 billion worth of assets have taken place just in the last 12 months. And they are not just buying this in the traditional way. They are buying the rights outright. So they are buying out all of the composer and the writer's interest entirely. We now have the prospect of big, deep-pocketed companies such as Hypnosis sitting at a table of the performing rights societies and actually speaking on behalf of the composer and the publisher in a way that has never happened in the 150-year history of collective licensing. And I call this the total funding model. And this is utterly unique and highly disruptive. So that's kind of the end of my session. Hopefully I haven't gone too long, but I'll stop the share now. Let's see if anybody's got any comments.
No, not at all, Dennis. That was fun. That was fascinating. Thank you very, very much. I think what we'll do is go straight into Rob's, and then we'll take questions for both of you at the end of Rob's. Just easier to run that way. So if you're ready to go, Rob, we can hand over to you once Dennis is ready. Yeah. Good stuff.
Okay, I think I am. So can you all see my screen now?
We can, yeah.
So you can see my entire desktop, which is the idea. Excellent, good. Welcome everybody. Thanks very much for the invite, Laura. My talk today is primarily a technical expose of a problem that I perceive in certainly a lot of my music. When I was around about 14, as an early trombonist, I was invited to play the trombone in the Albert Hall in a piece of music called the Berlioz Requiem. And I was probably second trombone in a brass band, which was right at the very top of the gallery. And it was my first experience of any type of spatial audio, and I've never forgotten it. And it's something which has lived with me really for the rest of my life. Little did I know that this particular building, which is San Marco in Venice, had a lot to do with that particular idea, because San Marco was basically, or is, a non-ideal audio environment where composers started to make use of the non-idealness, which is to do with the domes and things like this. So domes creating highly reflective surfaces. Now, composers have also, of course, taken ideas from visual art. So here, of course, we have the very famous Last Judgment by Michelangelo. And the Berlioz Requiem has a lot in common with that particular painting, owing to the fact that particularly in the Dies Irae that Berlioz used for the Requiem, we have this enhanced spatialization with different ensembles being placed around the orchestra. You can see that the orchestra is here on stage, but what you can't see is that above it, to the right and to the left, and also behind where the photographer would be at this particular point, what we have is a series of brass ensembles that are projecting their sound downwards and basically scaring the living whatever out of people when we came in. Now, in the 20th century, composers started, of course, manipulating these ideas further. So the fact that spatialization is nothing new, spatialization with loudspeakers did indeed become a feature. This is the absolutely magnificent Philips Pavilion that Yannis Xenakis and Le Corbusier, arguable story, but created together, let's put it like that, even though it always says it was made by Le Corbusier, with music by Edgar Varese. And this particular building was built specifically to house multiple loudspeakers so that people could walk through it and experience a very, very, very modernist video together with a very, very, very modernist score created electronically by Edgar Varese over multiple speakers. So this is all absolutely fine until we come to the situation of this. Now, this here is a simple drawing and a simple mock-up of a stereo spatialization system. So the idea behind stereo is that we are listening as a listener to two loudspeakers. And as a result of listening to those two loudspeakers, if we are listening in the correct position, and the correct position we're going to talk about in a few minutes, then what we will get is equal sound coming from both loudspeakers. And if we're very fortunate, we'll get sound which is coming from where the speakers are not present, inside here, sometimes outside, but let's go with inside for the time being, something which is known as a phantom image. And the whole essence of stereo is that these two loudspeakers allow the listener to create or to experience something which is known as a stereo field. And still to this day, the stereo field in terms of sound is an incredibly impressive listening environment when the system is set up correctly. But the issue of it being set up correctly is a major, major, major problem, because the stereo field, as you can probably see from this diagram, is based on the premise that there will be one ideal listening position, and that ideal listening position forms an equilateral triangle. It becomes possible to move, of course, within this particular stereo field, but as soon as you start to move within that particular stereo field, you start to ruin the phantom image, and at worst, you start to lose one signal altogether. in very simple terms, what happens if this particular listener moves closer to this particular loudspeaker, then all they will experience is the sound that's coming from that loudspeaker, and they won't experience that loudspeaker at all, meaning that you're possibly listening in mono, or you're listening in what I would describe as dual mono, where you're hearing something from there, you're occasionally hearing from something from there, but what you're not getting is this magical stereo image, this magical phantom image. So listening at home on stereo, listening on headphones is quite perfectly a practical thing to do. But you will realize from this that this relies on the fact that there is one person that can listen to stereo at any one time. So listening to a stereo system in a communal activity actually becomes nigh on impossible. And it's ironic that in room B01 in FMM, that we have a stereo system there, and the way that the chairs are set out, nobody is in the correct listening position, which is a little bit ironic, bearing in mind that we are a music department largely specializing in music technology. So there's an inherent problem with that. The problem becomes more severe when we go over here, because this is a mock-up of the most common surround system, commercial surround system called 5.1. So 5.1, we have 5 satellite loudspeakers which surround the listener, and we also have a subwoofer, which in this particular case is not shown, but a subwoofer is a single low frequency dedicated to low frequency sound. So there's one of those, and there's 5 of these other loudspeakers. So you can kind of see that with this, that the restriction, the ideal listening point for the listener with a 5.1 system is exactly the same as here, but it's arguably even more restrictive, owing to the fact that if you move anywhere out of that zone is something which we call the sweet spot, anywhere out of that zone, then the stereo image is ruined, but also the spatial image is ruined. Again, if you're watching a movie with one of your loved ones on a 5.1 system, you have to have these particular loudspeakers set up in this particular way, unless you have some box which is going to analyze your room in some way, so that it will change the overall levels of these particular channels to compensate. But the thing about this is that if there are 2 people present, then nobody can be sitting ideally in that particular sweet spot. So that in itself is a problem. The reason that 5.1 is a problem in commercial systems is that I've never been in somebody's house that has a 5.1 system that's been set up correctly. And at that particular point, you sort of have to wonder why on earth anybody would want to have a 5.1 system in their house if it simply doesn't work. So with that in mind, as far as my work is concerned, as I'm sure some of you will know, I do a lot of work with other collaborators, and this particular project here is Cosmoscope, and Cosmoscope was a sculpture created by Simeon Nelson with music and sound by myself, where I designed a spatialization system which would work for a public art space. Now, public art spaces differ clearly from the type of living room environment or listening on headphones. So when we are listening to a public art event, or when we experience a public art event, there are all sorts of differences from listening to your linear DVD. So your linear DVD, it's highly likely that you will start it at the beginning and you'll go through all the way to the end. There are a few basic things that you can do, but with public art projects, it's very, very, very unlikely, unless you specify it, that somebody will turn up at the beginning and stay until the end. And it's even more unlikely that they will stay where you want them to in terms of the sweet spot. So clearly, as you can see from this particular diagram here, we've got people that are actually surrounding this particular sculpture. So the challenge is how is it possible to create a sound system which will allow everybody experiencing the audio to experience it equally without having the problems that are inherent from conventional stereo. Now, just to confirm what that's like, I've set up a very, very, very brief model here. So here we have stereo, and this will be a nice experiment, because this will test how well Zoom is behaving, because sometimes Zoom seems to work in mono, sometimes it seems to work in stereo. But this is a sound file which I'm now going to pan, and the aspect about panning is that bang smack in the center where it is now, you should hear the sounds coming from both the left and the right hand channel. And as a result of that, you'll hear it centrally. So central mix, if your Zoom is working correctly, then we should be able to hear this in stereo, and we can hear something which is known as panning, so that you'll hear that phantom image, which you are currently hearing centrally, and you'll realize that there's no loudspeakers in the middle, of course, can now move. And at that particular point there, I've offset it slightly to the right. So even if you can't hear that in stereo, you'll have seen that in these particular systems, in this particular fader here, that what that is giving us is a visual display of how much signal is going to the right and how much signal is going to the left. Now, on headphones and conventional stereo, that kind of works okay. That doesn't work okay if this particular person here is closer to this loudspeaker. And the reason for that is, of course, is that if the person is close to one loudspeaker, then all they will hear is the sound coming from that loudspeaker, and it will mask everything that's coming from another loudspeaker. So with a conventional stereo system at home, you wouldn't do that. You'd sit in the sweet spot, you'd sit in the equilateral triangle point. But if you move at all, then you lose that stereo image. So with a public art project, such as the one we see here, you can see that nobody's in the sweet spot. And the reason that nobody's in the sweet spot is because that is where the sculpture is. So the sculpture here, the way that we designed the system here was that the sculpture would have speakers actually inside it. So there are 8 loudspeakers which are inside this particular sculpture. You can just about see one there. And then there are another, I think it's another 8 loudspeakers that actually surround it. So the people that you see here, there are loudspeakers behind them. So they are actually inside a secondary bank of loudspeakers. Now, they are all in different positions. And if you, very difficult to see, but if you can just about, there's a security person there and there's a loudspeaker and a subwoofer just next to him. So if that person stayed there, which people in public art don't, people explore, they move around, what will happen is that he should only be able to hear the sound emanating from that loudspeaker if we are projecting, say, a mono signal over all of the loudspeakers at the same time. Now, I have a great problem with that because I want everybody to experience the same high fidelity audio no matter where they are. So with conventional panning, as we've described here, clearly that panning situation, even if you were panning loudspeakers, panning sound over 16 loudspeakers, which is inherently possible, you clearly can't, that clearly won't work for a public art environment. So the solution is that I sort of came up with, but based upon other people's research, is something which is known as point source localization. So point source localization means that you are only ever sending sound to one loudspeaker at a time. So there's a nice little bit of programming logic going on here. And basically the rules are, is if the sound is going to one loudspeaker, then it won't go to the other loudspeakers. So in this case of the 5.1, if the sound is going to that loudspeaker, then it won't go to any of the others. Now, to demonstrate that in terms of stereo, simple piece of code down here, looks a bit ugly, but this should demonstrate what's going on. The source is noise, and noise localizes really well, meaning that we can tell where it's coming from. So if I just turn up my noise, you should now be able to hear some noise coming from the right-hand side, and there, noise coming from the left-hand side. So if I turn it on to sequence it, what I can now do is make the sound move from the left to the right really, really quickly. So we can hear that the sound is bouncing from the left to the right really, really quickly. This is not the same as panning. All this is a binary operation, basically saying that the sound is going to be on the left-hand side or it's going to be on the right-hand side. That's it. There's nothing in between. There's no sound coming out from both loudspeakers at any one point. So this particular technique, which I discovered at a conference around about 15 years ago in Canada, which was about sound spatialization, takes this idea much, much further, because you can do that with multi-speaker systems. So if we have a look at another piece of code, we can demonstrate it visually. So what I have here is a mock-up of the Cosmoscope loudspeaker system. So the 8 loudspeakers were arranged within Cosmoscope's inner structure, and then the other 8 loudspeakers were around the side. So I've just done a simple mock-up of this just to show as a light demonstration what could happen in terms of loudspeakers. Let's turn that one off, one moment. So I'm just going to just reset this just a little bit so you can have a look at actually what's going on inside here. So what I've got is a system whereby the sound itself is going to be projected to any one of these loudspeakers at any one point. So if I turn this on again, you can now see that we have a whole series of flashing lights. And those flashing lights indicate where the sound is going to be coming from. And as a graphic confirmation, that's actually quite useful to me as a composer. Now, at the moment, I purely rigged this up so that these are the inner these are the inner loudspeakers that are working. I can run this so that I can vary the speed of it, but I can also do some basic geometrical shapes with it. I can change the direction of them. I can change them from being linear to random. So obviously it's linear at the moment, so it's going around in a circle. I can change the shape of them, make it go different ways. I can do sort of stuff like that. But the golden rule behind all of this, even with this light display like this, is that what's going on here is that the rule is that one sound will come from one loudspeaker at any one point. So that will apply to every single loudspeaker that we're actually looking at here. So if I go back to my diagram, whoops, I'll jump ahead of those. So we've discussed the issues of that there and the issues of those as well. Cosmoscope ran using this piece of custom code. So this code is created in a piece of coding in a language called Max MSP or Max 8. And it's a piece of software that we use extensively within music. It's a multimedia tool primarily built for sound, but now with extensive video capabilities. But really importantly, it's built for real-time sound. So that means that all the processing is done in real time. It means that any systems that I run using Max, everything will be happening in real time. This is not something that you render out. So the way that it worked was that Cosmoscope had a series of, I think it was around about, oh God, 4,000 individually addressable LED lights that produce different types of patterns. I produced a clock. I produced a composition which lasted for around about an hour, which was algorithmic, well, exactly an hour. It was algorithmic, so it changed its structure as the piece went on. But we communicated with the light display using a WebSocket. And this particular software that we used, that a guy called Nick Rothwell coded the light display in, was called Closure. So this is Max now sending time details through to Closure to create a real-time algorithmic light and sound display. So at the moment, all I've described is a sound source that is going to be moving from one place to another really, really quickly, or relatively quickly. You may be wondering why I'm showing you a picture of where I would like to be on my summer holidays. And I think on a day like this, it strikes me as being quite a good idea. But the importance of this is that potentially, and something which I've explored a lot, is that this type of sound spatialization system, when it's done extremely quickly, starts to take on a gestalt configuration. So the word gestalt means, as a German translation, whole, or something which is complete, and it's a way of human beings making sense of what we see and also what we hear, I hasten to add. So if I go back to my holiday picture, we might be thinking that we're looking at a beach, some water and some clouds. Of course we're not. We're actually looking at a great load of pixels that we are making sense of with this. If this really was a beach, of course what we would be looking at is not a beach, but billions and billions of grains of sand, and the same applies to the molecules of the water and also to the clouds. So with music and with sound, the solution that I've come up with for this particular system is to use a really, really fast spatialization system, which is granular in size. So that means that the spatial movement from loudspeaker to loudspeaker can be less than 50 milliseconds. Now, as a result of it being less than 50 milliseconds, for us as human beings, we no longer perceive the sound as being in one loudspeaker only. What we perceive is, because they're moving so quickly, is that we are seeing, or we are hearing, a granular whole. In the same way as that when we look at the beach, we see a beach and not billions of grains of sand. Now, the knock-on effect of that, and the reason that I use this extensively, particularly in interactive, not in interactive works, in installation works and public art works, where people will be in non-ideal listening conditions, is that if a person is listening to one loudspeaker, or they're sitting very close to one loudspeaker, what will happen is that they can still hear the sounds coming from the other loudspeakers, because no matter how quickly this is occurring, then when the loudspeaker that they're close to is turned off, they can hear the sound coming from other loudspeakers. So it means that the sweet spot problem is alleviated when using point source localization in this particular way. As a result of that, I'm a real aficionado of point source localization. I've largely gone away and distanced myself from the very traditional view of what immersive audio is all about. This is not immersive audio. This is audio that's coming from one loudspeaker at a time. It's doing it very, very quickly. And as a result of that, it gives you the illusion that it's all around you, but without those particular sweet spot problems. So just to conclude, yeah, the Max 8 programming language, for anybody that's not aware of it, can be found on that particular website. It's a lot more accessible than it used to be. I am a firm believer in artists being able to code, no matter what discipline they're actually from. I'm also a firm believer that sound spatialization is an absolutely integral part of the composition process. It's not an add-on. It's not something which is done at the last moment. It's as important as rhythm and as pulse and as all the other musical parameters that we have at our disposal, but we need to think about it really, really, really soon. A bit of information about panning laws if anybody's particularly interested. The Brawl and Kasia site is excellent for sound localization. Sound localization means having an understanding of where a sound is coming from. It's the reason we have two ears. It's quite complicated, but it's a really, really, really fascinating area. That's it, everybody. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Rob. Okay, I'm going to open this up to questions. I know we've got a fair few musicians and sound specialists, researchers, practitioners with us. So Tim, straight in. Tim, join us.
Hello. Well, thanks both. That was so interesting. Dennis, just a question for you. It is quite terrifying, this whole thing of 100% buyout of royalties. And I know Netflix are doing this as well, and there's been a lot of blowback. Obviously, a lot of artists where they are established are able to kind of hold firm, so they're doing different kinds of deals. But I think the real problem is for emergent artists who, you know, don't have the same clout. What's the latest? I mean, how is it spreading? How's it working? What's happening elsewhere?
Well, the existing system seems to work quite well with the traditional studio and broadcasters, but the arrival of deep-pocketed, private equity-backed studios, particularly the money that Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and the new audio streaming platforms, for example, are spending a fortune. I mean, we think this year there's likely to see a quadrupling in the number of movies being made in America to feed the kind of streaming market, but all with a brand new set of rules that they are trying to impose on the rest of the world in terms of how music is treated. The number one reason for this is because Netflix in particular does not want to pay public performance fees for the broadcast of its shows. That's the number one driver for this. So, for example, if you have a piece of music that's used in an ITV broadcast or BBC or Channel 4, that money is reported in what's known as programmers broadcast to the PRS, and you get paid. And you get paid, hopefully, your composer share and maybe even the publisher share. You get paid. Usually 3 to 6 months after the broadcast. What they're doing is they're buying out that right.
Yeah.
This is not alone, because there are even worse things going on in production music, where there's a company called Epidemic Sounds, which is buying out rights, is giving composers, young composers such as the ones we have in our program, $250 to buy out all the rights. And they are then selling that on as production music. And guess who's using it? Amazon. Amazon is using that. Their library is littered with stuff from Epidemic Sounds for use on their Twitch platform, because they've suddenly discovered they were using music without permission. So it is this an analog system that still isn't fit for purpose in the 21st century, if one's honest, but still has some virtues. There's a kind of virtue about preserving the norms, meeting headlong the kind of aggressive push from digital platforms that actually just want to make money and don't want to deal with the niceties.
Yeah,
it's not looking good. I'm sorry, I was too negative, but it is not good.
On a slightly more positive note, there are benefits, obviously, from the kind of digital explosion in music, and artists being picked, quite a lot of artists, even huge artists, being picked up from YouTube. People doing well through Spotify who wouldn't probably have got radio play, who found a way in. But then, as you said, it all tends, once they're picked up, they tend to funnel into this tiny, narrow band. But at least there is some democratization still.
I mean, the astonishing thing about music is it's one of the last things any content producer will ever think about budgeting for. So they're going to make a $500 million movie, and then they'll allocate $100,000 for the use of music, and they'll want everything to be used. And then they don't want to pay public performance fees. So it's an afterthought, and that's the tragedy of music uses. And it goes back, the history of the 20th century taught us this. Radio stations don't want to pay much more than they have to. They don't see any obligation, and we've been fantastic through collective licensing in being able to hold the line. Anything that undermines the collective licensing model, in my view,
that is the big fear, isn't it? And I know myself from doing films, you know, it's almost always at the last minute. It's always arguing about trying to get a decent fee, and I think that's where they always will cut back, because it comes at the end of the process, exactly as you say.
Well, the kind of rapacious nature of the music industry, the one positive aspect, I think, of the music industry, I would always advocate, I'm a strong advocate, and I used to be a director of PRS, is collective licensing, because it levels the playing field, it gives people a degree of certainty and comfort. Anything that undermines that actually increases the precarity or the precariousness of being a creator in the modern world, and you're just subject to market forces then.
Yeah. That was fascinating. I've got one quick question for Rob, because I've got another meeting, unfortunately, too. If I can just ask my very quick one to Rob. Rob, I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and share your frustrations. I went to a mass firework display where I was right next to a speaker, and it was laughable what was coming out of it. Because why would you have a stereo that far apart? Why they just didn't go for mono, I had absolutely no idea. It was absolutely hilarious. But what I'm fascinated by with the point source localization is what's actually being sent to each speaker. Is it the channel for that speaker that's dropping in and out, or are you moving them around?
Yeah, it works best sending a mono signal to all as many loudspeakers as you've got. So one source being sent to 12 loudspeakers, and you're simply turning them on and off. So as I say, it's kind of a NOR gate type system, where the system is saying send a sound to one loudspeaker and then send it to another. When it's sent it to another, turn the other one off. And it's doing that really, really quickly. And then you can create geometric shapes by doing it. Having said that, simply doing that simply becomes a demonstration of the technology. So one of the things that I've done with Sam's multi-channel films, and also with Cosmoscope, is to do a combination of the two things, to have point source localization, but also to just send single sounds to all the loudspeakers, so that you get a mono send. And the combination of those two things works quite nicely. You know, I can't tell you how many demonstrations of spatialization systems I've heard, and you end up thinking, well, that's a very good spatialization system, but it's a really boring noise. You know, it's somebody walking, and you sort of think, well, fine, but it doesn't make it any more interesting just because it's spatialized. So that's what I was trying to say about integrating the composition process into the spatialization to make it a homogeneous thing, I suppose.
How does the experience vary from it just being all in mono to having it darting about with mono?
If it was all in mono, you would hear no spatialization at all. You would only hear sound from the speaker that you're closest to. Whereas when it's moving around, you can distinctly hear that a sound is moving from one loudspeaker to another, owing to the fact that you're not close to a loudspeaker that's playing. In the same way as when you were saying about your firework display, the reason that you couldn't hear anything other than that one particular loudspeaker was because that one loudspeaker was masking all the sound from everywhere else.
Is it, you said it was a mono feed going to all of the speakers?
It doesn't have to be, but that works. It's clearest like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I need to chat to you more about that at some point, because it's really interesting. But thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Bruce was patiently waiting.
Yeah, hi. Two fascinating talks, and appealing to both ends of the things that interest me, the techie side, and also the aspects of making money from music. And Dennis, it completely resonates with me. Earning a significant of my part of my income from music performance, TV and things like that. I suppose the question was, to what extent do you think the value of music and the way consumers perceive the value of music has had an impact on all of this, and has helped carry this idea forward? Because there is a sense, perhaps, that when physical was the primary means of people actually consuming music, they understood the value of music more easily, whereas now it's something that it becomes more like wallpaper, and it's something that people can take advantage of, if that is the view.
I mean, I think that's entirely true, because, and actually I can give you the example from something the photographers said in one of our projects for the IPO. They said that mass infringement of particularly photographs has been normalized. And the problem we had in 2008, 2009, I was in the room when the deal with Spotify was done. And I was one of the dissenting voices saying I didn't think it was a particularly good idea, because I felt it was normalizing the reduction in value. Because even in the era of piracy, you could say there's a CD worth, I don't know, between £5 and £10 over there, and that has value. And what we basically said to people was, no, everything is now reduced. This is the Bowie prediction, is utility. It is just that. And the fact that you can get the 80 million tracks, the availability of 80 million tracks, 70% of which have never been used at all, by the way, but that's another story for another day, for £9.99. But when you look at the global picture, you realize the actual value of music is even further discounted. I mean, in India, you can get the Spotify account for $1 a month. And the only countries that actually maintain relatively high subscription levels is the UK, Scandinavian countries, that's pretty high. Everywhere else, you're talking about quite attritional levels. Most of Latin America is below $1, probably 50 cents. Most of Asia, the same. There are about a dozen countries that charge somewhere in the region of $5 to $6. So globally, the value of music has been substantially reduced. And yeah, it's flowing water, it's a utility, yeah, it's fine, I can have it. And then and that'd be all well and good if actually people could then get paid properly. But because the antiquated system that we still maintain from the 20th century doesn't do the job properly, it's still not fit for purpose, people aren't paid properly. Billions of, we reckon, the black box, as it's so described, to describe money that hasn't been allocated, is some of the order of $2 to $3 billion a year of principally composers' money that is not being allocated correctly. It's barking. So,
yeah, completely agree. Yeah, thanks, Dennis.
Thanks very much,
Stephen,
Bruce.
and Dennis, that doctoral submission. Yes. Well, you've just heard my pitch, Stephen. This is it.
Stephen, you're next up.
Oh, right. Okay. I've got a meeting at 2, but I'll try and squeeze it. It's the questions I put up, really. I mean, I think primarily to Rob, and that, you know, I absolutely compelling stuff. What I wasn't sure is, you know, if it could be, you know, if 60-70% of the work is your, you know, the question's yours that you formulated. It could be, you know, absolutely world-changing research within the field. I wasn't quite sure how you were building on the work of others, that's all.
Yeah.
You know, who are the big hitters in the field? You've come along and you said, guys, hang on a second, you haven't thought of this.
Yeah, it's certainly an interpretation of people's work from, particularly in granular audio, from the last 30 years or so. But I suppose my take on it has been how to go about sequence it and control it and actually integrate it into a musical composition. That as you know, I always describe myself as a composer, and it is that way around. I'm a techie composer. But that for me is the important part of it. But yeah, point source localization in a way is not new. If you think about symphony orchestra, that's exactly what a symphony orchestra is, because there are spatially arranged instruments in a field, and that is something which, of course, this is taken upon. But clearly, I can sequence those particular sounds in a way that can't be done in any other way. So that is the new part of it for me anyway, although I'm always extremely hesitant on thinking about these eureka moments. You know what it's like, because
you shouldn't be.
You should really, I know, but as soon as you're tempted, you find that, oh, somebody else, anyway, but yeah. So it's certainly an interpretation for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it might be worth at some stage, just you know, when we meet to talk about the art science stuff, just sort of thrashing that out in a short paragraph, because it could, you know, it could be really really helpful for everybody, particularly
because there is a lot of science going on there. It is to do with the perception of sound and where we perceive sounds that are coming from.
And research into choral music from the 16th century, thinking about those call and ripostes from Monteverdi. I haven't heard it in St. Mark's, but I have heard it just up the road.
Absolutely.
Where they have the responders standing behind, and that is a very weird.
It really is, and because of my trombone playing background, I was brought up on Gabrielli and Monteverdi a bit later, but that for me is exactly where all of this has come from, because I spent most of my time not playing on stage, but actually behind audiences, and thinking very well, not me thinking carefully about where the sound's coming from, but that was clearly the idea, that this immersive sound, and so that is not new. There is nothing, just because loudspeakers came along, that they were not responsible for sound spatialization. Absolutely not.
Well, being that assertive is good research. Yeah. Listen, this is getting nerdy because we're sharing our love of Monteverdi with the.
Yeah, I've got no idea what anybody's talking about.
I've got another meeting. Listen, both. That was, you know, thank you so much for that. It's really, really instructive and fantastic to see ways in which music, you know, in inverted commas, music research is embedding itself within the, you know, other groups. I love the way you cover lots of bases as well, not just one research group, 3. Thank you.
Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Mike.
Hello, how you doing?
Hey.
Nice to see everybody. Yeah, my question, I suppose, was for Rob. I liked both presentations. I've skinned both games. I worked at the company in 1997 that did the first commercial MP3 audio release in the UK. And it was really weird. And we used to get hate mail at the company from like the PRS, and a guy at a conference said that I was doing evil, and I said, "Oh, I'm just here as a representative for the other, like for the guy who runs the company." I realized that Tim, who kind of like had financed the whole thing and thrown me under the bus and made me stand there. Well, I'm not kidding you. People in bands said that I was responsible for bootlegging their music because, like, no, I put one MP3 on a website at it was like a crazy era. Yeah, it was bonkers. Yeah, I once spoke, anyway, that's not my point of my question, but really interesting subject both. Thank you very much. The question I had really was for Rob, and I do these multi-channel sound installations, sometimes my own work, sometimes with music composition, sometimes with spoken word, and then I also do them for other people, install people's stuff. I'm doing a couple this year. Big things, and I use Dante system, and I sometimes use between 8 and 20 speakers. None of them arranged, and I don't arrange them in these sort of spatialization things. And the question I wonder, I had to write it down because I wonder if this is stretching the matter, fine, but I wonder if the real problem with multi-channel audio is almost one of ontology. And I say that the relationship between the listener and that work you've created is about the questioning of reality. Yeah. And what the reality actually is they are listening to in playback. It's interesting when it's in Max and it's live, that's one thing. This is a thing that's made directly for the speaker. But I wonder, like with this playback thing, what are we doing? And
that's a really good question, Mike. We ought to have a chat about that. Partly because of my background in live performance, I am very, very, very unhappy about the idea of loudspeakers being perceived as being non-live. That's one of the things. So when I'm creating installation spaces or anything which is going to be for a non-concert hall space, really, I'm very keen on the idea of that system potentially evolving, certainly changing and making decisions, but fundamentally being different, so that every time that somebody goes to an installation project, whilst it might be fundamentally the same project, they will experience something which is different. So that is a basic premise for what I do. God, as far as the ontology of it, I don't know the answer to that. I think that's
I don't know either, and I don't know why. Like, I'm asking you, but it does seem to me like we do this stuff without thinking about what it means. Like, say for example, like 40% of the audience has significant hearing loss, which means they'll never hear it. Then we have the fact that we now have these, like you talk about Gestalt. I think about like this Gestalt thing that if you're mixing 5.1, if I do a couple of ads every now and again, you're mixing an ad in 5.1, we can never put dialogue in the background. I could never put a lead violin line in the background, in the speaker's surround. I could never put them, everything has to be from Proscenium March, this kind of stuff. They want the sub to boom and bang, and then they want the dialogue right in the front and center. It's just, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, I think that some of the commercial so-called surround systems are fundamentally flawed. And so I've never, the only ever time I've heard a 5.1 system working properly was when I used to work for Which as one of their sound consultants.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Cool. And that was the only ever time. And every other time I've been thinking, well, all I can hear is the sound that's coming from the rear. And that's because I'm sitting marginally somewhere else. And for public art projects, that's just not acceptable.
No.
The basic premise behind my thoughts upon, I mean, fundamentally are to do with the fact that it sounds great in my studio. So why can't it sound as good, if not better, when I'm in another environment, in the environment that it's supposed to be in? And that, I think, I've got a lot to learn from that. I mean, I fundamentally believe that I always try to mix my projects on site. So if I'm doing a gallery project or something like that, I will spend a considerable amount of time, and I'll make sure that that's the reason I code this stuff, so that I can do this live. So it's not just handing over a DVD and pressing play and hoping for the best. It can be built for that particular system, and I feel that integrates it into the, if it's a site specific piece, it integrates it into that. But I absolutely take your point. I think that's a really, really interesting question. And
I mean, I wonder too, like say for example, there's Randy Tom's recently been on a rant online.
yes.
And he's really good at doing these rants, right? And I've shared it with the students because there is this question about Dolby Atmos.
Yeah.
So you say, okay, so we have this still screen at the front, right? Screen at the front. And obviously the big things that we're hearing in Atmos are Marvel, Star Wars, Disney, this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, it's still at the front. So the dialogue is still only coming from the front. The lead lines of the music can only come from the front, because if they come from, you have this sphere of 42 speakers around you. So we could throw anything into that, but the audience doesn't like it. They get confused. User testing says, don't put any dialogue in the back.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. The other thing that they did then was look at the number of sound editors that is increased in the credits of these films. There's now 100 or 150, and I think that's super cool. But as Randy so rightly points out, you know what they're cutting? They're not cutting effects. They're cutting what Dolby ontologically did by naming it Dolby Atmos. They're cutting atmospheres.
Really interesting. Yeah.
And so it's like they're just adding tons, these swathes of like spaces, and sending crews out to the Hebrides and all these places to record 20 minutes of a wave and all this kind of stuff, and then putting it in these surrounds. And I don't know that it makes the films any better. And I don't know that
I mean,
any better.
you know, as you know, I don't work in that type of commercial film. And the films that I have worked in, I found fascinating. I mean, primarily because I work primarily in stereo. But as far as installations are concerned, of course, you don't have a front or a rear. There is no one particular point of focus. There is no screen. There might be, but frequently in our case, there absolutely isn't. And that's one of the reasons why I've used this type of system. I have thought about using point source for Dolby Atmos, but all I think that will happen is that it would absolutely annihilate people.
Yeah.
I would love to experience it myself, but
we should have a go. So Professor Val says that we should make that little dubbing suite downstairs into an Atmos space. So, and maybe what we could do is we could say that computer needs to have Macs on it, and it needs to have Ableton and stuff, so that we can do some of the stuff in pure data, so that we can do some of this stuff. Because at the moment we are kind of like servicing a very commercial vision, and it would be nice to be leaders, you know, in that way.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. That was amazing.
You're welcome.
Very much, Mike. I think we've lost an awful lot of people at the turn of 2 o'clock to other meetings, unfortunately. But I will just ask if anybody has any other questions. I'm going to take that as a no. So Dennis and Rob, thank you very, very much for 2 very different but both very fascinating presentations. I really enjoyed hearing about your research. It's not something that I get to hear much about very often, so it was nice to hear something a little different. So very much appreciated, and yes, we'll see you at our next meeting. Thanks everybody.
Thanks
very much indeed.
Thanks everyone. Bye.